my name is Andrea Purcell. I am geographically located in Los Angeles, California. This is where I work from, and I do some of my work here locally and geographically, and then some other of my work is nationally focused. That's the work we're actually going to talk about a little bit today. I'm an educator and a practitioner at heart, and I have been a classroom teacher. I've also been the principal of 2 schools here in Los Angeles, and I'm currently working for a nonprofit organization called Big Picture Learning, which may be familiar to some of you, and it may be the first time some of you have heard about it. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what we do there, and definitely invite lots of questions if you're curious about what we do. My role at Big Picture is varied. It's just the way I like it. I'm a restless spirit, so I like to have lots of pots cooking at the same time. I'm officially titled a school design coach, but I also am the director of several initiatives for Big Picture Learning, including one that I'm going to talk about today, which is the transition of a credential called the International Big Picture Learning Credential from our schools and our work in Australia to here in the United States. So that's a little bit of a framing. Oh, also, probably my most critical role is I have 2 teens, neither of which is in the house right now. So one is a freshman in college, and the other is a senior in high school. So let me just jump right in. We're talking today. I had titled this presentation, I have to actually go back and look at it because it was a lot of words, shifting aspirational outcomes to shape relationships and school experiences. And what we're really talking about is how our goals, either our personal goals and or the goals that we set for the youth with whom we work or the people with whom we interact, really impact and drive the programming and activities, the kind of experience that we set up to facilitate the achievement of those goals. So I wanted to start today by inviting you all to just think to yourself of a current personal goal that you have in your life, anything. And then sort of once you're holding that goal in your mind, I want you to think about how you're orienting your thoughts, your intentions, and really your life activities in reference to that goal. And perhaps later when we engage in more open dialogue, we'll have a chance for you folks to share, if you want, some of what your thoughts are. But what I really wanted you to do was kind of hold that in mind, whatever your personal goal is and however you're working to achieve it or referencing that goal in your personal life. I want you to hold that as a frame as we talk about goals and orientation, and how they drive programming and activities in learning settings. I know some folks here are engaged in alternative types of learning environments that are not a traditional classroom-based 4-wall K-16 educational system. And so I'm going to do my best to refer to learning environments because I firmly believe, and in our practice at Big Picture Learning, firmly believe that learning happens in lots of spaces and everywhere we go. So trying to let go of my school-based language in all of this work, really, but also in my comments for today. Let's see. I sometimes forget to do slides. I think I'm not going to do slides until we actually need them because I'd rather just talk to you and see all of your faces directly. So by way of sort of contextualizing, I guess, what I wanted to talk about today, wanted to just comment for a minute about assessment in the United States, especially assessment related to the K-16 system, or really the pre-K-16 system at this point. And I think, you know, we all know that assessment in the US is big money. And it also carries really high stakes. It carries high stakes for individuals. It carries high stakes for systems, for individual schools, for educators. There's lots that's sort of attached to the assessment systems that we currently have in place. The measures that we choose and the value that those measures are assigned really research has shown, and we can see it firsthand, it's systematically and really clearly exacerbated in many cases, in fact, it's created social inequities. And in my work and in my work as an educator and just as a citizen, to me, that's not okay. It's not something that I'm okay with. It doesn't sit well with me. The thought that our assessment system and our measures are predetermining who is going to have access to a variety of outcomes. That's potentially our assessment systems are limiting the kind of forward mobility and forward motion of some of our youth, really as young as, when we're talking about things like, say, reading scores as young as early elementary school, and how those can have predictive impacts on youth as they're moving forward in life. That's just one example, of course. So in the work that I've been doing most recently, really have solidified my belief that offering an assessment system which includes all the ways that students are smart, including applied academic and cultural sources of evidence, can really be and is a game changer. I want all of our youth to be successful and have lots of doors open to them post-secondary, and as they sort of begin to participate as adults in our communities and in our society. I actually believe that we should teach to the test, air quotes there, because we want our youth to be successful. We all want to be successful. And I mean, think about the personal goal that you imagined just a few minutes ago, and you want to be successful in achieving that goal. Because we want our youth to be successful, we'll teach to the test will help facilitate their achievement of those goals that are set for them. So I really do believe that ensuring that we have a fair and inclusive test, something that measures what matters, is of critical importance. And that's the work that I'm going to talk about today and that I've currently been engaged in. I think it's important always to ground a little bit in history. So I'm going to talk a little bit about big picture learning and sort of the historical context of the work that I'm currently engaged in with the IBPLC. So the co-founders of Big Picture Learning are named Dennis Littke and Elliot Washer. They founded Big Picture Learning at a school called the Metropolitan Regional Center in Providence, Rhode Island in 1995. And their intention really was to change the experience of learning for secondary students. So both Dennis and Elliot really understood that the learning goals toward which educational activities are oriented critically impact the construction of experience, the allocation of resources, including the allocation of time, human capital, energy, money, all of those kinds of things in a school setting. So with that in mind, they began their work at the Met, and it's beyond my capacity at this minute to talk and drop links in the chat. So I'm going to drop a whole bunch of links in the chat later, so I can link you to Big Picture Learning. I can link you to the Met website because it's still operating. But they began their work at the Met with a set of new measures that drove work and programming. And now I am going to show you something because I think it's helpful to be able to see this while I'm talking about them. Oh, excuse my clunkiness with Zoom. Well, that didn't work. Hold on a second. Oh, there we go. Oops. Sorry, I tried to do something fancy and it didn't work the way I wanted. So let me go back to my non-fancy way of doing things. Oops. Well, that's not working, so I'm just going to talk. So the learning goals at the Met and in Big Picture Learning, there were 5. that originated. I'll share the deck with you folks later so that you can look at them and don't have to worry about keeping notes. The 5 learning goals were empirical reasoning, quantitative reasoning, social reasoning, communications, and personal qualities. And very briefly, personal qualities was looking for evidence that students understood themselves and others, and that they were willing to use that understanding of their strengths and their capacities to take social action. Communications is the ability to express ideas, to connect and influence others. Social reasoning is looking for evidence that students are making contributions to society through an understanding of social issues. Quantitative reasoning is, in its most simplest form, thinking like a mathematician and applying the skills and tools of mathematics to understand the world around you and to communicate ideas that you're generating. And empirical reasoning is the thinking like a scientist and the use of skills like observation, experience, and experimentation to explain phenomena and be able to make decisions about things that are happening. And you'll notice that there, for those of you who are classroom educators, your brain might immediately go to, oh, empirical reasoning, I get it, that's science. And quantitative reasoning, I understand, like my frame of reference is math. But the language around the big picture learning goals is very purposefully open and general, because the kind of evidence that we're looking for in big picture learning context is applied knowledge, and it can be drawn from multiple different sources of evidence. And that framing is important because it has impacted the kind of programming that's developed in our schools and our network, because big picture is not just school-based. We also have out-of-school programs that are part of our network. So in any case, so this is the foundation of big picture learning. Almost 30 years later now, since the beginning of the Met, we have certainly seen the efficacy of big picture systems in supporting youth toward positive life outcomes, both in career and in post-secondary academic programs. The original big picture learning goals really measure how a student is smart when observed in interest-driven and authentic learning opportunities. So starting from 30 years ago, the assessment systems at the Met were really around capturing that idea of how a student is smart and looking for multiple types of evidence to contribute to the educator's understanding of how a student is smart. And that's in opposition to how smart a student is. So it's like just a little bit of a play on words. But if you think about traditional assessment measures, it's really asking how competent or capable is this student in performing on a test, if you're a classroom educator, for example, and how are they smart in biology, for example? How can they show me the different parts of a life cycle, or how can they show me their use of a multivariate equation, for example, on a test? How well can they construct a 5-paragraph essay using appropriate MLA formatting? And I'm not disparaging any of those things. I was an English major. I have a high respect for articulate writing, and I have found the tools of writing and the structure of writing to be really helpful in communicating my ideas over periods of time. So it's not to disparage the content. It's just to say that often our school-based assessment systems are asking for one source of evidence to show that a student is capable of doing things. And what Big Picture tries to do is broaden that and say that there are lots of different ways that all of us as people present the ways that we are capable and what we know and what we're able to do. And all of those are valid sources of evidence for us being able to determine how a student is smart. So the assessment and evaluation systems that were in practice at the Met from the very inception included things like individually constructed, co-constructed learning plans that included the student's voice, the advisor's voice, who's the primary teacher in a big picture model, and also that student's parent or guardian. So individualized learning plans were constructed around student interest. Goals were set at sort of the beginning of each term. This plan was revisited, sometimes on a weekly basis, but definitely on a regular basis. And it was constantly cycled through to update and shift and change and pivot as a student learned and grew throughout the course of the time. I should mention that in a big picture design model, students are paired with an advisor for the duration of their tenure at a school, which is often 4 years. Although at the school that I was at and where I was a principal, our students didn't come in as true freshmen. So it's whatever that duration of time was. If it was 6 years, if it was 4 years, if it was 6 months, the individualized learning plan was something that was part of the assessment system that guided the work and the facilitation and the mentorship of the advisor in the school. That individualized learning plan was coupled with end of term robust and what we would consider high stakes exhibitions, so presentations of learning that students would give. And it is important to note that still our practice of exhibitions is not a quick 5-minute presentation or a group presentation. Exhibitions more often are allocated 60 to 90 minutes at the end of, for every single student, starting in 9th grade, all the way to 12th grade. For them to have these conversations, they are often publicly attended. So for example, at the school where I was a principal, we would invite our board members in, student mentors, community members, friends of the school, parents, and a student may not know everybody, kind of how I'm presenting to you folks, and I know a handful of you, but not all of you. This might be an example of the kind of panel that a high school student would have in his or her exhibition at the end of every semester. So if you were there as a true freshman, you would be offering no fewer than 8 exhibitions over the course of your tenure in high school that were tied to the individualized learning plan goals that you had set. Also, part of the big picture learning assessment system were student curated portfolios, which if you've been engaged in any kind of holistic education, especially in the school system, really in the past many decades, it's a familiar practice. When I was in a classroom, I had a bookshelf with those big 3-inch 3-ring binders and lots of like robust, incredible evidence and narratives and reflections and all of this wonderful material that really showed the learning arc of my students and really showed the conversations. They were documentation of our conversations that we had had with their parents and with them and sort of their learning over time. They were incredibly rich resources, to me as a classroom teacher. So all of these assessment systems have been in place in big picture schools. It's not unique. A lot of schools have these kinds of elements. These are just the things that, this is how we call them in a big picture setting. The challenge, of course, is that in any of this kind of learning, in whatever setting that we might be in, when you've got things like a bookshelf full of 3-inch binders that show evidence of student learning and progression over a period of time, that's incredibly helpful to me as an educator in being able to look through. It's incredibly rich for the student themselves as an artifact and perhaps for their parent. But when the student is trying to present themselves externally to opportunities beyond the 4 walls of the learning environment that they're currently operating in, that's a really clunky presentation. And when we're talking about entry into our sort of more formalized US or even global post-secondary education system, I know a lot of you are from SOU, so imagine sort of your application process and imagine if the best source of evidence that you had for what you were capable of and why you should be considered for admission was a 3-inch 3-ring binder, or even a digital portfolio that had lots and lots of Google Docs and photographs and all of those kinds of things. Or imagine you're applying for a job or an internship or a scholarship. That robust bit of evidence doesn't translate well into something that's easily digestible to an external facing audience. So about 6 or 7 years ago, I should mention that Big Picture is a global network of schools. And so we have about 200 schools and programs that are operating around the world, besides the US, which has the most programs, because this is where we were started. The critical international mass of our schools are in Australia. And they're headed by my colleague Viv White and John Hogan, who are the co-executive directors of Big Picture Australia. Viv decided that she wanted to tackle that issue, that challenge of converting with fidelity the kind of learning that has been represented in big picture learning assessment systems into something that was more easily digestible by an external facing audience, both in the university setting for admissions and also in the workforce. And so our colleagues in Australia came up with a new credential called the Big Picture, International Big Picture Learning Credential. And they worked with the University of Melbourne and a psychometrician and her team there, whose name is Sandra Milligan. And they really thought about the kind of evidence that big picture students typically present in things like their exhibitions, and things like all big picture students also have internships, interest-based internships. So what is the kind of observational data that we can collect as educators when we're looking and watching the interactions of students in authentic workplace settings, when we're listening to feedback from their professional mentors? What are we hearing from other teachers? None of this excludes perhaps more familiar school-based sources of evidence. So you can still take a math test if that's part of your practice or part of what you need to do. If you're taking the community college class in calculus or pre-calculus, the grade there does represent a source of evidence. But what the IBPLC does is it creates a more inclusive net so that we're able to also capture different sources of evidence. I'll speak personally for a minute. So I have a son, he's in his first year of college, and his primary interest is aerial cinematography. He wants to be a filmmaker, but more specifically, he wants to be a filmmaker behind the camera who uses drones or gets to fly helicopters and like outfit systems of, he hasn't got a pilot license. He hasn't actually flown a helicopter yet. He's only 19. But he is also not a language-based learner at all. In fact, writing is painfully challenging for him, and reading is not the best way for him to be able to intake information. So for him, school-based assessment systems limited his ability to show his passion and his capacity and how capable he was. I imagine that for a lot of you, this may feel or sound familiar. Think about our English language learners, for example, who are in the process of becoming bi or multilingual, which is an incredible skill to have, something that, you know, it's a skill that I don't have with fluency or with fluidity, and I wish that I did. I know that it changes the way that your brain fires, and it creates all of this like incredible richness in your thinking and your perspective. But think about if, you know, you are only allowed to demonstrate what you are capable of in a language that you are currently learning, and how does that limit your presentation of capacity and your presentation of how you are smart? So again, the kind of system that we're talking about here is not meant to exclude school-based assessments, but it is meant to include all of these different sources of evidence and all of these sorts of things, so that students who are neurodivergent or who are language learners or who are coming from a different cultural perspective or just prefer to demonstrate what they know and understand using different mediums, that this system is meant to capture that. So Viv went ahead and did that. Now I am going to try to share my screen because I think it's important to feel. There's Viv. I won't try to do anything fancy though, because this is what Viv came up with. So this is a dashboard of the IBPLC, the International Big Picture Learning Credential, and I'll orient you to really a couple of critical sections on this. So what you can see up here, I had talked a bit ago about the big picture learning goals. I said there were 5. That's true. At the inception of Big Picture, there were 5. Now there's 6. Australia added a 6th learning goal called knowing how to learn. And what you see over here is that this is a snapshot of the evaluation, the judgment level on a scale of 1 through 5 that an advisor has assigned to a student in his or her senior year. So the IBPLC is something that's used and engaged with in the equivalent of grade 11 and grade 12. And the actual credential is administered as a diploma and as sort of a final certification from secondary school globally at this point. So these are snapshots. It's graphically represented by this flower petal. And these are all the learning goals that I talked about before: personal qualities, quantitative reasoning, empirical reasoning, communication, social reasoning, and this new one, knowing how to learn. So levels 1 through 5 are the judgment levels. On the dashboard, there's a really brief description of what that level means so that somebody at a glance can say, okay, I understand that students, this student, Abby, quantitative reasoning, she was evaluated at a level 4, which means that she is competent and confident users of mathematics in her life. And then, of course, you can click on stuff so that you can get a little deeper view of what that means if you want to. But it's kind of that snapshot perspective. We've also been talking to university admissions departments in particular that the University of Melbourne has ascertained that incoming freshmen are typically between a level 2 and 3 on the IBPLC criteria. So it's important to note that somebody like Abby, who has all 4s and 5s, is somebody who has shown real exceptionality in her capacity. This would not be the expectation for every recipient of the IBPLC. This is a fixed section of the IBPLC. Once the judgments have been given, this stays fixed in the same way that your high school transcript, you don't go back, if you major in US history in college and change your B from your senior year or your junior year to an A because now you know more. So this is really a fixed part of the credential. There's some parts of the credential that are also fixed. One is over here. This is an advisor statement, which can be thought of as a proxy for a letter of recommendation. So remembering that in big picture practice, that an advisor is somebody who knows a student over the duration of their tenure at the school over the course of potentially 4 years. And this is a statement from that advisor to an external facing audience about what that advisor sees as the student's strengths. Of course, there's a photograph here. This is a student curated list of achievements. They can put whatever they want. They can put their internships, work experience, awards, honors. This is also something that is fixed because it's meant to represent what they accomplished in high school. The parts of the credential that are not fixed are these 2 hot links. And one goes to that wonderfully student curated online portfolio, external facing portfolio, which is a requirement to receive the credential. Often this takes the form of a website for students, although I've seen some students get real creative recently and use like their Instagram accounts and that kind of thing, whatever really medium they feel most comfortable with. And then this is also a changeable link according to a student, which is their video statement. It's usually a 3 to 5 minute video introduction of that student that they produce themselves. And so it's not meant to be an elaborate production, unless of course you're like my son and you want it to be because you're interested in film, and that would represent your capacity well. It's really just meant to be a student introducing him or herself in their own voice. So it's a snapshot. So at Viv, I'm going to talk for like 2 more minutes and then we'll get into some conversation because I know I've been talking a lot. This is a lot of information that I've been presenting. What they did is they created this, they negotiated this with University of Melbourne and with other institutions in Australia. They piloted this. They're in now year 5 of their pilot. This year, they're set to administer as the only final transcript and diploma to 750 students in their schools across Australia. And currently, 40% of the universities in Australia accept this as the only source of consideration for university admissions. So they don't need to convert this into a more familiar transcript for the universities, that their students will be considered for admission just based on this dashboard. They've educated their admissions departments enough so that they feel comfortable with the kind of the presentation that this offers. About 3 years ago, we started piloting the IBPLC here in the United States. And so that's the work that I am currently directing. We are currently, because you folks are in a US context, so you'll know that the politics and the regulations really vary broadly, state by state, and sometimes within each state. We are in California, Washington, New York, and Vermont. And we are soon to be in Hawaii, and we have conversations with going with Colorado and also with Connecticut. So this last June, we issued our first 12 final credentials to graduating seniors. We are not yet at a stage where students are using this by itself for consideration for university admission, because we would never put our students in a position where they had an unfamiliar credential that admissions offices may or may not consider. So we're working on that for this current cohort of students, and we are on track to issue approximately 50 credentials for this June to students in the US. It's important to note also that we've got, it truly is an international credential, that there are currently credentials issued in Kenya and also in Barbados with our school that's there. So that's a bit of a broad overview of what we're doing. I'm sorry that I spoke so long about it, but I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts, perhaps how you're connecting this to the framing that we did at the beginning about your own personal goals and how that sort of drives the kinds of activities that happen in your own life. And of course, any questions that you have. So Jackson, do I see a hand raised?
Yeah. Hi, Andrea. Thank you so much for coming to speak today. I really appreciate it. Um, would you mind pulling that slide up again if it's convenient with the
Sure.
certificate? Um, so just early on in your talk, I wrote some things down that really stuck out to me. You talked about kind of the big business behind standardized assessments and kind of the structure and the pipelines that create. Something you said I really like. You said our assessments predetermine and limit the outcomes of students. And I think you reposed the question from how smart is the student to how is a student smart. And I was just kind of I don't think I know much at all about these credential here, but I am curious kind of like um how how do you come to these levels? What assessments are you using to give these levels, and how have you used this new system in a way that you feel is different than kind of the assessments that you see as limiting the outcomes of students? Because I don't know anything about this, but just the things that were jumping in my mind, I was like, oh no, numbers like level 5, 4, like what how is that information used with in relation to the student? Are they aware of their levels? How do they achieve the levels? I think you get the general gist of kind of what I'm curious about there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to talk and pull something up at the same time, so forgive me for a second. The short answer to that is that there's a lot behind the levels. So it's not um, there's both a training, a professional development, and authorization process before anyone can actually administer the IBPLC. But also, this is where the psychometricians from University of Melbourne come in. So they really developed a system behind those levels that is now able to be analyzed statistically for reliability, and eventually for when we have more longitudinal data for validity around like the predictive potential of each of the levels. So if you have like a level 3 in communication, for example, at the end of high school, how does that impact your ability to be successful and functional in a university setting or in a post-secondary? I will show you an example of, let's see if I can get it up. Give me 1 second, forgive me. The way that students and teachers engage with the IBPLC, specifically around this issue of, oops, I lost you guys on Zoom, around the levels is that there are frames like this one behind each one of the systems. I'm sorry, behind each one of the learning goals. So this is an example of empirical reasoning. And you'll see here over on the right-hand side, these are the progression levels, and there's a description of what each one of those means. And then the frame, it's really used as a rubric, but they call them a frame. It's around 3 buckets. So for quantitative reasoning, for example, we're looking for evidence that a student is exploring, investigating, and evaluating. And then the further you get into the middle of the frame or the rubric, the more detailed it gets around what the criteria are for being able to evaluate and assess. It's important to note that advisors and students are looking for sustained and consistent evidence over time that a student is able to so it's not just a mathematical equation of like, okay, well, in this column, you're a level 2, and in this column, you're a level 5. I'm going to take the average of all of that, and therefore you're at a level 3.5, for example. An advisor doesn't assign a progression level until that advisor is certain that a student is confident at that particular level. And it comes through dialogue with the student. It also comes from sources of evidence. When we're talking about like the real technical meat of how a progression level is assigned, there should be no fewer than 3 robust and complex sources of evidence per moderation or judgment cycle. And there's at least 3, 1 at the end of junior year, or the equivalent of grade 11, and 2 in the senior year. And again, the final correction level isn't administered until the end of 12th grade. But for each of the 6 learning frames, there should be no fewer than 3 complex sources of evidence. So they should be interdisciplinary. They should have like potentially applied components to it. It's not just one 5-paragraph essay. It's sort of like a whole portfolio of writing, for example, that's being considered. And we know that those are complex enough if there is a minimum of 8 data points per source of evidence. So for each frame, a student is being considered against no fewer than 32 data points before a progression level can be assigned. Does that answer your question? Or perhaps raise more?
I think it raises more questions, but I really appreciate the feedback, and I think it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense to me. So I thank you for showing those extra slides. That was helpful to kind of see how you go further into each kind of category, and yet you don't average things out at the same time. I think I kind of understand.
Sure. I mean, I think if you folks have been engaged in any sort of alternative learning context, it will not be unfamiliar to you if people are talking about the learning as being non-rigorous or fluffy or sort of grounded and based in feel-good types of education. And I think everybody should feel good about their learning. I 100% would agree with that statement, but that doesn't mean that we can't have statistically valid, rigorous, and reliable sources or ways of capturing and documenting that learning that really, with fidelity, demonstrates what a student is able to do. Rebecca, I see your hand.
I have 2 questions. One, it sounds like you guys are still in the early stages of taking off here in America. So I wanted to know what your biggest obstacles are right now. And then you also mentioned English language learners, and that's kind of in my heart sort of point for me. So what does that look like for English language learners with this style?
Sure. Well, let me answer that question first, because that's the easier question. So there is nothing that says that sources of evidence cannot be presented in a language other than English against the IBPLC. In fact, they are. So in Australia, we've got schools who are working with Aboriginal communities, and students are doing some of their learning or all of their learning or parts of their learning using a native language. We have schools here. In fact, one of the pilot schools right now, the program is working with level 1 English learners. And so a lot of the students who are participating in the program at that pilot site are doing most of their presentation of their understanding, their learning in a language, in this case, because well, it doesn't really matter where it is, but in this case, most of them are presenting their sources of evidence in Spanish. And as long as the educator has the capacity to be able to understand the complexity of learning in that in the language that the student is presenting in, there's nothing saying that they can't present sources of evidence in a language other than English. In fact, I would encourage students who are multilingual to present sources of evidence in more than one language, because in a lot of ways that shows their advanced skills in communication and may be able to differently present what they're capable of doing in some of the other learning goals as well. The challenges and the obstacles are significant, but not insurmountable. So I think that they, from the ground up, if I'm going to work from there, there's sort of mindsets, which is perhaps one of the bigger challenges in sort of showing folks this particular system, helping them to shift from strictly content, especially in secondary school, a content orientation and a disaggregated content orientation, in, for that matter, and a grade-based system, to one that's really about sort of applied learning in context, and that can be really applied anywhere. So there's a mindset shift. That's something that we're working on. And then, of course, there's the recipients of the credential, which could be, for example, authorizers of schools. So it could be local agencies, school districts. Do they understand this? Are they willing to sort of consider this as a credential or as a way of demonstrating matriculation or completion or certification for the group of students for whom they're responsible or who they serve? And then there's the receivers, there's the university admissions offices, of course, and also employers actually is the easiest nut to crack at this point, because the information that's contained on the IBPLC is very easily convertible to a resume. And it's also not hard when sort of an employer is oriented. They can see you have a letter of recommendation, you have some sort of like statement of skills, and then you've got a portfolio of student work, and you also have sort of a proxy for a resume on the credentials. So that's less of a challenge than university admissions departments. So for example, here in California, if any of you are California context, the university state system in California is you either have passed your A through G curriculum, which is, I know there's lots of familiarity. I think in Washington, it's the CADERs. Or the regents, there's sort of specific criteria and things that you have to have done. Cracking into those departments, especially again for the California context, when admissions offices are considering hundreds of thousands of applicants, opening them to sort of a different system in their admissions department is a tough nut to crack.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Sure. Other questions or thoughts or?
If no one else has questions, I do have another one, if that's okay.
Sure.
So, could you kind of take us through, I mean, so really the big picture is a curriculum, and what is the process of getting schools to adopt the curriculum? How does that look like in a legal sense with the state or the federal government? How do you do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is it completely depends on where this work is trying to be organized. So when Dennis and Elliot started the Met in Providence, they had the full endorsement of the state commissioner of education, and they were basically given a lot of autonomy to be able to execute the program and the design that they felt was in best service of the students that they were inviting into the space. That is not the same in every context, and it depends. So I'll give you a counter example. So here, the Big Picture School where I was a principal was affiliated with Los Angeles Unified School District, but it had to be an independent charter school. It was the only sort of local political model that would allow for the kind of autonomy over the allocation of resources, including our scheduling, that would fit the design of the school. That's not even the same as the school right up the coast in Oakland, called the Met West, where they had to go to an administratively, not in practice, that's important to note, independent studies model. That was the way that they were able to operate and function in their local context with their district and in partnership, but they are a district-run independent studies model. So some of our schools, all of our schools are public schools, but some of them are district schools, some of them are programs within a school. Some of them are charter schools, some of them are independent studies schools, some of them are continuation schools or alternative education schools. And we also run programs in the out-of-school context. So it may be of interest to this particular audience that we're currently doing our first pilot of the IBPLC with a homeschool network here in California, just north of Los Angeles. The power, I think, of the credential is that because it captures so many learning in so many different kinds of environments, this doesn't have to be school-based. Parents can be trained, of course, there's an authorization process for it. Folks who are running out-of-school community-based programs can be trained. Out-of-school educators can be trained to be authorized to administer the credential as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. This is interesting. So I'm thinking, I guess, does everything kind of revolve around setting up for these exhibitions? Like, I guess I'm trying to put like the kind of the building blocks to understand how the curriculum kind of works. So is it like, more or less like a standard type of school setting where the advisors have, because they're setting up these individualized plans with the students. And so are they teaching, like, how is the teaching done? Is it on like a class basis? And then, they kind of like breakout sessions with individual students, and then they prepare for these exhibitions so that the student can demonstrate their knowledge in their own way. I'm just kind of, I guess, curious as to like the teacher-student relationship and how that like kind of culminates into these exhibitions.
Sure, that's a great question. So the structure in a big picture program is really can be described as referencing a student interest, and interest, practice, and relationships are sort of the key words in any big picture program. So we want learning to be student interest driven, and not necessarily career or post-secondary oriented, really like what are you fascinated by and passionate about right now in this moment, that interest is valid, that you should have the right to be able to engage in that interest at the depth and for the duration that you want to engage with that. And I should note also that while most big picture programs are secondary, we do have K-8 programs as well. So sort of, it's easier sometimes to imagine, like, what would you tell a second grader who came to you and said, like, my passion right now is Pokemon. And would you tell that student that that's not a valid interest and that it's not worth their time to be able to sort of investigate? I hope that we wouldn't. We would agree that we want to let that student sort of run with their engagement. So we sort of carry that forward and believe that a 10th grader who comes and says like, well, what's your interest right now? And they say, well, I want to learn how to, you know, score the most goals in a soccer game in the most efficient fashion. Great. If that's your interest and passion, fabulous. Does that mean you're going to be a professional soccer player? Not necessarily. It doesn't matter. Right now, you have something that you think is worth your time to investigate. So we start with the student interest. But we know that students don't share their interests unless they trust folks, especially those of us who work with teenagers, know that a teenager is often looking for like, what's the catch? So if you as an adult educator are coming to me and saying, what are you interested in? What's your passion? They're looking for like, why should I share that information with you? And how are you going to use that to get me to do something that I don't want to do? So this relationship component is really critical. And when we talk about like understanding that and how that drives programming and the allocation of our resources and time, that's where advisory comes in to our programs. And advisory is not 15 minutes of homeroom once a day or 3 times a week. Advisory in the most high fidelity big picture schools is almost the entirety of their time at school. So at the Met, when they first started, for example, students were in advisory 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Tuesday and Thursday, this is where the practice component of the design comes. Students starting in 9th grade were in internships in the field in workplace settings with mentors who shared their interest. So if I had students who came in and said, I'm passionate about makeup, and that's what I want to do, and I want to learn, then they were in an internship with an esthetician or a cosmetologist or somebody who is cooking lipstick, you know, and doing the chemistry behind it or whatever, twice a week. And the rest of the time they were in advisory. The individualized learning plan was meant to drive and facilitate how they were attending to quantitative reasoning, empirical reasoning, personal qualities, communications, and social reasoning within the context of the experience they were having in their internship. And sometimes that takes the form of workshops, and sometimes that takes the form of adult-driven lessons. And sometimes when your local regulations demand it, for example, in California, it takes the form of more allocated time towards disaggregated content area classes. But we try to not do that unless it's necessary, because we know that the learning can happen using the resources of the school and organizing them without saying period 1 algebra, period 2 pre-calculus, period 3 world history, if that makes sense. So the activities, the assessment system is actually part of the learning, and the preparation for things like exhibitions, the setting of goals, and then like the converting of those goals into action that's happening, the experiences that are happening throughout the course of a semester, is all the meat of the exhibition. And of course, there's communication skills and presentation skills that are included in how do you prepare for an exhibition, especially if you're holding court for 60 to 90 minutes and you're 14 and a half or 15 years old and you haven't done that sort of thing before. So those things are also being taught in advisory, and students are being prepared in that way. But really, the important part is that a student has had experiences to talk about that are meaningful to them. And as a general rule, we find that if students have actually done something that they care about and they're meaningful, the exhibition is not the hard part of the whole learning cycle. Trudy, I see your hand.
Yeah, I had a question. Maybe you mentioned this before, but how often can they change their interest? I mean, I know, a lot of times it's like, well, I'm super interested in this, and then, 2 weeks later, oh my God, I hate that. So is there a time frame of how many different interests can they have? Do they pick one interest and they stick with it? Or I was just curious how that works. Maybe you mentioned, I don't hear what you said. So
no, there isn't one answer to that question. And I think part of that is a negotiation with the advisor and with the parents. And sort of what their knowledge is of the student. So, you know, if a student is avoiding going deep and engaging in rigor by changing their mind all the time, that would be a different, like we'd have different work to do with that student. If a student is genuinely, like most of us, holding multiple interests at the same time, and they can't choose one, or they haven't decided on the one that they want to investigate the most deeply, we would work with that student differently. I think as a general rule, we try to have students working roughly sort of in a semester-long flow, mostly because of internships. And because finding, and our students find their own internships. It's not like a predetermined job board. They go out and they do informational interviews and they do site visits and they sort of negotiate with mentors in the field. It's not a group thing either. It's not like, okay, we've got, 17 opportunities at Kaiser, so pick one, that you're going to do. So because there's so much work that goes into the actual finding of an internship, we try to encourage students that once they've found one, to stick with it for a period of time, usually around a semester. But when we can avoid it, we try not to tell students that you can't change your mind. We want to talk them through that and figure out sort of what is it, because we want to honor the fact that all of our minds can change and pivot and pivot. And sometimes an interest that we thought we had resolves, and we realize that that's not something that we want to go deeper in, and that's okay. Paul? Hello, Paul.
Hello. Hi, Andrea. Hi, everybody. Yeah, beautiful. I so appreciate what you do, Andrea, and all the folks at Big Picture. I had the privilege of knowing some Met students many years ago. They had a relationship with Goddard College while I was a student there, and I met students who were master's candidates who had followed essentially the same approach to their education, from writing a learning plan to finding and identifying resources to articulating a timeline of deliverables or work completion, like all the way through their schooling. And by the time they were, adults, it was palpable, the skill set that they had. So yeah, I've really appreciated that kind of general approach for a long time. Just going back to, because you just had mentioned the internships and the mentor part of the Big Picture program, seems so important, so critical that those mentorships are not only allowed to happen, but curated to some extent. Like, I appreciate the idea of, like, they go find their own, and that's what's so great about it, partly. But it also, I would think, has the potential for going bad. You know what I mean? And
100%.
And yeah, it just seems like so important for the advising system to be really into the careful curation of those internships. Because once those kids are out of the sort of predictability of a school setting, and they're in the workplace or whatever play place that they've chosen, I don't know, that just feels like, to me as a teacher, that feels scary. Like, we're letting our kids go out into the world and hoping for the best. Like, I don't know. So
Yes.
just noticing that. And then the other thing that I can't remember if I've talked with you about before, but do you know the expeditionary learning approach and Ron Berger's work in particular? There's just a lot of, I think, synchronicity between that aspects of expeditionary learning and Big Picture. I don't know if that's a conscious affiliation that you guys have had or anything.
Yeah, I don't know historically. And please don't feel like I can be contacted. Andrea and Cameron can share my email information. I know we had an hour. I can stay on for as long as you guys want to talk. So let's keep talking. But if you got to go, I won't be offended. So I don't know if there's a conscious or a direct affiliation, but I certainly think that a lot of what Big Picture does is just good teaching and learning. And so it's not that there isn't echoes or parallels. There isn't sort of a proprietary nature to these kinds of practices. There's a lot of familiarity, I think, across folks who are really encouraging students at the center of learning and looking kind of for how we can be in service of students rather than students being in service to sort of like the structure and the model, you know, of a more traditional school system. So I would agree, although I don't know of any direct affiliations. On the specific topic of letting the kids out into the world, just like the IBPLC and what's represented there as a holistic picture of student capacity and learning is undergirded by really a lot of structure and a lot of sort of rigor behind it. The internship program and having students go out, there are a lot of checks and balances to that system. So it's not just like go find a mentor, an adult in your community and kind of fly and then come back and report on it. There is a setup meeting where an advisor is on site with the student, talking to the mentor about like the goals and the expectations and sort of all of the different systems. We now have a tech platform called Emblaze. Our out-of-school platform is the same, it's just called Be Unbound, where an advisor can actually see when a student checks into their internship, geographically they're pinpointed of like, are you on your couch or are you actually in the place that you said you're supposed to be? For the student has to set a goal each day and then check out when they have left. Of course, there's parent and guardian signatures and permissions. Every time a student is in an internship, approximately every 3 to 4 weeks, there's a drop-in site visit from the advisor. So the advisor can actually see the workplace context and setting. And every week that a student comes back from an internship, there's meant to be reflection with their peer group, with their advisory, and also with their advisor. So it's not, there should be a lot of communication happening between the workplace mentor, the student, and the advisor, and then when necessary with the parent or guardian coming in. But there are certainly checks and balances. It's also one of the reasons that we encourage students to find their own internship, because the process of going out and doing, say, 10 informational interviews with prospective mentors, and then narrowing that down and saying, now I'm going to go to the workplace setting and do like a half-day shadow day with 3 of them. Like all of that like leads to a buy-in and sort of a knownness about what a student is walking into. And it also sort of says that, is this a good fit? Because a great mentor for one student may not be a great mentor for another student, for example. And we want to test that out before a student commits to, say, coming, you know, for 10 to 16 hours a week to spend time over the course of a semester. I see Sarah, a hand raised.
Hi, I think I'm unmuted here. Okay, so I have a quick question. I, first of all, think this sounds amazing. And I homeschooled for a long time, all of my own personal kids, and I have a daughter that's a freshman in college and is super smart, but never passed a state test ever, but could compete nationally and build her own wind turbine and do all kinds of things. So I'm fully aware that there's a problem with state testing as far as really gauging where actual kids are. My question is, how do you, I guess, get to the end of their time with you with big picture learning and gauge that they actually have enough mathematics skills and those kinds of things to go on to, say, college and take math in college and be where they need to be, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of answers to that. So again, it depends on your local context. In some places, in many places, in fact, big picture schools do have to show and convert whatever the work is that students are doing into content area credits, and they have to show that on a transcript, because either the state won't allow students to graduate with a high school diploma without a recognition or, you know, a documentation of those credits, or for whatever other reason. My wishful answer, and maybe this goes back to sort of the title of all of this about shifting aspirational outcomes, is that, you know, the math skills in particular, and math is the hardest one, because I think we're all conditioned to think of math as like a sequential set of skills, and that it's very like calculus is not the same as financial literacy, is not the same as geometry, and that those are like specifically different disciplines, and you have to learn them in a certain order. And to be honest, the way that math is taught, there's truth to that, right? That you can't solve a multivariate equation necessarily unless you've learned sort of the basics in algebra 1 of a single variate equation. And it's really hard to do that if you don't have sort of the skills of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, or you don't understand whole and partial numbers and that kind of thing. My wishful answer is that like math is an incredibly useful mindset, logical thinking, spatial relations, like the ability to manipulate numbers and to be able to understand things as represented in graphs and data and in all of those kinds of things. So the wish is that the math would come when it needs to come. And so for a student who is specifically interested, say, in building wind turbines, to use, if it's with your permission, your daughter's example, like there's all kinds of math that's critically necessary for her to be able to actually be able to go forward and do it. And as she was learning that, the natural learning cycle would suggest that she would want to learn that more advanced level competency in mathematics because she was really interested in building alternative energy sources, for example, in this case, in the form of wind turbines. I'll give you another example. I'm working with a student right now. He's in our IB PLC pilot, and he's a senior at a school in Los Angeles. He is not on track to receive an A through G diploma, and he won't qualify to enter the four-year public university system in the state of California post-secondary. But what he does is he builds, I don't even know what you call them, they're like motorized tricycles. They're almost like dune buggies, and they go like 60 miles an hour. Like it's crazy. What he builds these in his garage, and it's his passion. And he's like spent hours upon hours working with professionals and like honing his skills. And he sells these things for thousands of dollars after he builds them. When I sit down in his exhibition and he starts talking about how he learned how important it was to get the angles right when he's bending the steel frame, because it impacts the structural integrity of these things that he's building as they're going 60 miles an hour, down the road. He is 100% demonstrating applied mathematical quantitative reasoning beyond what I understand as somebody who has advanced post-secondary degrees and kind of passed pre-calculus when I was in high school. So it's that balance, I think. Most of our schools currently, especially for math, because of state regulations, have to teach in that sort of sequential content-driven way. In other schools where they have more flexibility, including some of our international schools, they let the math come in when the math needs to come in. And, we know, like I know from my experience as a principal, that most of my students, if they decided that they wanted to go into university, to a four-year university, most of them had to take a test that placed them, after they were accepted to the university, into the math that was the right math for them, content level wise. And a lot of them needed remediation. This was even with passing, a specific sequence of math coming through high school at levels that were impressive on our state tests and that kind of system. But those who wanted to go into the hard sciences, including engineering, often had to go back and sort of revisit that specific content. So as a parent, especially as a parent of kids who are currently in or transitioning into college, I understand the anxiety of, like, we want our kids to feel prepared, as they're going into this. We don't want them to feel at a deficit, and we don't want them to have to go back and sort of redo things. Another way of thinking about it is that if they need that math, they will be motivated to learn that math, and then they will engage with it in ways that is more meaningful to them in an applied way in the future. So I don't think that there's one answer to that, but there's sort of our wish that the learning comes when it needs to come, when it's relevant. And of course, as educators, it's our responsibility to introduce that to students, because if they don't know, like, what the application of Algebra 2 is in their projects, then they can't be curious about Algebra 2 in their projects, and the components of it.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Hey, Ronnie, I see your hand. Oh, you're on mute still.
It has been delightful to listen and learn from you today, Andrea. My students have had a lot of questions, and you've done a great job of answering a lot of our questions. And I do have to take them on back to our class for some other activities, but I know I speak for all of us that we're very grateful to you. And
Thank you for bringing your students.
Oh, thank you so much. And my students come back at it's at 6 o'clock. Take a break, come back at 6 on our own Zoom link. And again, great gratitude to you. Thank you.
Thank you. It was lovely speaking with all of you. Please feel free to reach out if you've got additional questions.